Carole D. Saram, when did you first start to identify yourself as a feminist?
Well, I kind of thought about that, and when I first started growing up, I never even heard the word feminism. But then I thought, how did I feel like I started viewing it is to stand up for what's right and wrong. And I remembered that at home, my mother used to read a lot. We always had books in the house. And I was reading as a child about all these famous people who suffered through this and that and became the champions of causes and Lincoln. And I remember in school there was a big thing in the New York City school system about boys maybe not having to wear shirts and ties to school. Well, the children in New York at that time, for the most part, were not wealthy, and the clothes were pretty bad. And so the teacher said about speaking about something in the class. So I got up and I spoke about Abraham Lincoln growing up in a log cabin and wearing furs and such, and became president of the United States, and why can't the children of New York wear to school what they want? And all the kids started pounding on the desk with their little knuckles going, ding, 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 ding. This was about the third grade. And the teacher threw a fit. So needless to say, I got a failing grade. But then I said, no, I'm right. And then that only made me feel stronger about standing up for what I felt was right. And that's how I got into that. Looking back out in hindsight, of course.
Your very first protest was against Procter & Gamble in 1964. What offended you, and what did you do?
That was back when the television, they showed the woman in an apron and how you began your day with cooking this and cooking that, and that was the perfect little life in the perfect little kitchen. They brought out an ad for Tide soap powder with a woman with disheveled hair and spoke like a moron. I mean, really bad. I mean, this wasn't even funny. And I was so shocked that I actually wrote a letter to them, a full-page letter explaining why this was bad, and also that I was switching to another product, and as long as she continued, I may find out I like this other product better and not go back to Tide. Well, I got a full-page letter back saying they had changed the ad. It is no longer that way. They apologized. They sent me a box of soap powder, but they also said that now that it was corrected and they were sorry. So obviously this went further than just my observation. But it also showed me the power of writing and standing up for what's right. And I carried that forward.
In 1970, you went to your first NOW meeting. How did that meeting change your life, if it did?
It turned my whole life upside down for the better. I was working for the American Stock Exchange then, and we were automating the stock exchange floor. This was a whole new field with IBM. And I was working, and one of the women said to me, oh, look at this. The Wall Street Journal front page had a little blurb about this meeting being held by women. It was being held in the basement of a church on the Upper West Side about a march for equality, strike for equality or something. And I said, what? And I always felt this wanting to do something. And so I figured, let me go. And I went. And I remember the reason for the basement in the church is none of the other places would rent to the women at that time. They considered them some kind of a communist conspiracy or whatever. So I went down there, and it was chaos. I mean, the place was filled up with women all by themselves, and this is what it got me excited. And they were all talking about doing this march and this and that. I remember Jackie Sabias up on the stage, and there was a big fight, should they or shouldn't they? The mayor left town. He shrunk from the whole width of Fifth Avenue down to one lane.
Which mayor was it at that
Lindsay.
time?
Mr. Liberal left town on this one. And so they decided we're marching. So I met up with two women that had just 2 weeks before hung the banner, Women of the World Unite, off the Statue of Liberty. So I met up with them, and they said they were going around that day to hand out flyers and to go to businesses and tell them what they were doing wrong against women. So I linked up with them, and we went to these places. They looked at us, what are you talking about? Now, at that time, organizing this march, you have to remember there was no computers, there was no cell phones, television wasn't really covering it. So we would have been happy if 50 people showed up. And I'm walking on Fifth Avenue, and all of a sudden I see buses coming and people coming from all over, literally thousands. There was a bus from Connecticut with nurses where they used to wear their hats with the type of school they went to, coming off, women with baby carriages. We went into Central Park. It was packed. And they made us line up on the lanes there over by the Plaza Hotel, and the cops were there, and they were angry. These were the Irish cops that, first of all, women were not exactly on their list of feminism. They definitely were against that. So there was a stand there that the media was, and they said, oh, well, women as usual late. They're still late coming out of the park to march. The reason we couldn't march out of the park is the police wouldn't let us out. Meanwhile, the traffic now in the intersection of over there on Fifth Avenue by the Plaza Hotel came to a screeching halt because the police only had a few police there. They did not anticipate, which later was said to be 30,000 people. Some numbers are a little higher, but I'll settle with the 30. And so in front of us was some of the women who had experienced marching in anti-Vietnam marches. And we had the banner, Women of the World Unite, and I think I had it in my coat in the front, hidden, because we knew if the police saw it, they would take it. And I remember Jackie, and they said, start marching and don't stop. The anti-Vietnam women in front of us, and I'm going, ah! And so now we started marching, and we started pushing out, and pushing the cops too. And some women said they got hit by the cops with the nightsticks. Anyway, we get to Fifth Avenue, and Jackie said, start moving to the left and the right with the banner, like pulling it out this way, and don't stop. So we started chanting, move on over, or we'll move over on you. And I remember there was a photographer down on the knee taking a picture. We just kept going. And we finally took over Fifth Avenue, was screaming and yelling. At that time in New York, people came off work about 5 o'clock out of offices, and 6 o'clock they were out of the city. We're at near 5 o'clock now because we were held up for 2 hours. And the Fifth Avenue started filling up with all the people pulling out of office buildings, and they were just shocked. And the pictures, you can go back in the newspapers, their mouths would go, like, what's going on here? And McGovern was running for president, and his guys were not nice because they were yelling, hey, girls, gals, go home, you know. And this was like chaos. But anyway, we started chanting, and we took over Fifth Avenue. And I remember walking down the avenue, and I had this feeling of being liberated. I almost could cry now thinking about it. I said, I'll never, ever go back again. Never will I ever go back to that. So now we get down to the public library, 42nd Street. Now, 41st Street, we were supposed to turn and make a right to go into Bryant Park, where everybody was speaking. Gloria Steinem, Bella Rabzak, and all feminists and such were speaking. And there across Fifth Avenue was a row of horses, police horses, and the policemen with their helmets down and riot sticks. I mean, these big, huge ones, which they used on anti-Vietnam marches to break up marches. And I looked at them, and I remember a woman with a baby carriage and a stroller, and I thought to myself, oh my God, this is like Dr. Zhivago, the movie at the Winter Palace. And I said to myself, if I had to, would I march through this line for the cause? And at that moment, to make a decision, well, thank God I didn't have to make it because we made a right to go down 41st Street where we were supposed to go. But it was at that moment, and they glare. I mean, you could see the glare, the hatred. I mean, I think they were like shocked. They probably had to send out a notice for the police department to get them out on these horses because they had 30,000 people on Fifth Avenue. They did not know where they came from. We didn't even know where everybody came from. So now we're on 41st Street and with the banner, and they were doing construction on the side of the library up to the second level. I'm afraid of heights. How in the world I ever got up there with these women with this banner, I have no idea. All I know is I'm up there, we rolled out the banner again, and the women coming by put their fist up in the air and were cheering. And women told us later when they saw the police, they felt so bad and lack of spirit and felt they lost and blah, blah. And when they turned into 41st Street and saw the banner up there, Women of the World Unite, with us up there with our fists, they said it was wonderful. It made their spirits soar. They felt like they were winning. And so we all went on to Bryant Park, heard the speeches. I went home on the subway. I vowed I would never, ever go back. And I never did.
Well, you had a very interesting background considering, in other words, how did you evolve from the background on Wall Street, in banking, and in business to become a leader of what was called ZAP actions? In fact, I think you were called General ZAP. And I'd like to mention 4 different things that you were involved in. Could you explain each one of them and what you did and how it happened? The American Stock Exchange shut down. Could you talk about that day?
All right. What happened is, because I worked in Smith Barney, American Stock Exchange, in a field they did not know what we did in computers. All they knew is they had a higher IBM. Wall Street was the last to automate, by the way, because they wanted control and they didn't want to give it up to a machine. And because of that, in programming, thinking logically, you had to plot everything out from the first moment to the last, and it had to balance. So you thought through the steps of everything logically, and that was this is hindsight, of course, but that was my way of thinking. So I was then seeing, I was offered a job at one place in what they call an arbitrage system, and they told me, don't even bother to be interviewed, the job is yours. Here's the salary. And they had to call me up and apologize because the man in the department did not want a woman. And here the company needed this. There was only a few people on Wall Street could do an arbitrage system. That wound up, the president of the company called me up, Whedon and Company. But I couldn't go against it because I knew I'd never work again. So now I was fired up how to bring this to everybody's attention in my naivete. So I remember walking into the now office, and it was up at the air, and they were going to do another march, and Jackie Sabias was there, and I walked in, and I said, what can I do? She said, well, there's an employment meeting in there, why don't you go in there? So I went in there, and they were trying to think of should they stand in front of a building handing out flyers. And I said, no, I know how to make attention. I said, because the thing I was working on was the stock exchange and the ticker. We had to figure out how to not have it stop, or how to stop it, because the guys used to go happy birthday on it or something. So I says, I know how to do that. So I told them what we could do, and a few of these other little things. So it was fun plotting it, but not carrying it out. That was another matter. So they said, oh, no, it's in 2 days. We're going to be down there. So it was Grace Welsh. We went to her apartment with this big Muslim material, laid it on the floor, and I had gone into the stock exchange and measured the windows because Abby Hoffman had thrown down dollar bills one year and disrupted the floor. So now they put windows up there. So I measured each one. We made a letter on this material, woman power, and then we folded it up in front of me and tied it to me, and we practiced from me standing on one side of the room and the women grabbing it, running it across the apartment and pushing it up at like a window. So I went down to the stock exchange and I registered as the Garden Club, because you had to register because they were worried about anti-Vietnam people. So now we send out this flyer called, I came up with the word ZAP, meaning zap 'em. And they had people calling me up from the TV and radio, and I said, no, I can't tell you. You're just going to have to meet us in front of Trinity Church. And they even had the top of the news media calling me. No, you have to be there. Well, again, it's one thing to think these things up. It's another thing to do. I came out of that subway. I was terrified. I was so thin and my knees were knocking. You could hear them go boom, 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 boom. And I had to wear the spring coat. Underneath there was the banner tied to me. Now they had to go through the cemetery to get to the American Stock Exchange, carrying these big cameras in those days. And these were these big burly union guys. And they go, what the hell we got to do this for? So I go in and I say, oh, there's a garden club. And the man says, oh, yes, go right up. So we go upstairs. We ask the tourists, oh, please step back. I go to the end. We take the banner. We shove it up against the glass. Well, the floor went berserk. I knew they would. They started booing and screaming. The guards tore it down. We shoved it up again. Now the guys are cheering, yay! So what's happening? They're not trading. If they're not trading, at least the guys that put it in, we're not putting it into the system. The ticker's not moving. So that's how we stopped that. So now they got into a fist fight with the guards and da-da-da-da-da. So now we go out, traipse over to the Treasury steps. We took over the Treasury steps and putting some papers together last month for Smith College. I noticed that the photos taken by the Daily News front page literally all the offices emptied out into Wall Street. And there was thousands of people, shoulder to shoulder, and the men, even to the extent of having their feet up on the first step of the Treasury. That's how many filled up the street to see them. Who are they? These women or girls? You know, that was what? Girls. That was what the Daily News called us, girls, and they showed us with the banner. Then we took it over to Tom Brown's bar and sung It Ain't What It Used to Be, and told them they had to open up because we had nailed to the front door a new law saying they could not discriminate against women. And so the guys just said, serve him, you know, it'd be fun. You know, so anyway, we sung Roll Out the Barrel and all that. So then we marched out of there. The following year we did Citibank, and I'll tell you about that later, though. But that's how we got involved in that. But the amount of consciousness raising that came out of it. But, the point was to the press is to have 4 short sentences. Why are we doing this? And the reason was to show that women were not hired in top positions in Wall Street other than secretaries and clerks and such. And the salaries were, if there were, God forbid you got a job, the male earned sometimes 50% more than you did. So we used those sound bites to tell why we did this, and that was the reasons for this. And with the fact that restaurants and bars were not required to serve you because you were a woman.
The Statue of Liberty. What did you do out there?
Okay, the second time we took the banner up there, and that was before the Citibank event, and we took it over the Statue of Liberty, and we went up there and we tried to put it out again, like the first time they did Women of the World Unite, but this time it was only women power. And one of the guards, interestingly enough, went over the ledge to go after one of the women. And had he pulled the banner, she probably would have fallen off. Thank God one of the other guards yelled, "No, don't," you know. The last thing we needed was a martyr, but this would have been terrible. But interestingly enough about it, they took photos of that. Someone had a camera somewhere, and one time I was there as a tourist one time, and there they had it as what the United States stands for. And it showed us out there with the Women Power banner and cheering on and doing this. But unfortunately, there's no copies because someone came and burned the second floor of the Statue of Liberty one year, and all those records were destroyed. But what we did after that is, one of the things, because now I worked for a chemical bank, and knowing there that, again, there's no female officers and you could not even get credit. There's no way you could get a loan on anything unless you had your father's signature or your husband's signature, or a credit card was given as Mrs. Brownsmith, but never in your name. So I had Citibank advertised they were going to open accounts for women. No, for anybody, for $2, or, you know, you could open under $5. This was to get you to open accounts. So we all opened accounts for $2. And so we then posed as customers in the branch. We picked the one on Park Avenue because it was open. The main one on Wall Street was too dark, and we had to worry about safety. So I go in, and I walk up, and I said, I'd like to talk to a female vice president. Well, of course, they didn't have one. And so they knew, because the press had put it all out all week, we were going to raid some bank. So they went on the phone, they said, they're here. And now in the back, this was like a Hollywood setting. In the back was a row of elevators on Park Avenue. The elevator opens up, and out he walks with this pencil mustache and a lackey on each side, boom, boom, down the center of this branch. And he says, can I help you? And I says, well, female vice presidents, you don't have one. Well, meanwhile, all the women were posted around the bank, filling out little deposit slips or on lines. And you know, these days we wore dresses, so they all looked nice. And they turned to each other and they said, did you hear that? And the other one said, what? Citibank discriminates against women. They have no female vice presidents. Oh, that's terrible. I'm closing out my account. And another woman on the other end screams, I'm closing out my account. All over the bank, women are screaming, I'm closing out my account. They shut the doors. They wouldn't let their own customers in. So then they said, we had to get online, and the tellers were laughing. They said, would you like these in coins or bills? Well, I tell you, they had a oh, by the way, we took the banners outside, we demonstrated. They took that skit and used it in a movie, Stand Up and Be Counted or something, with Charleston Heston, taking place in Chicago on mortgages.
Of all people.
Yeah, and they did this. They took the whole thing. But what happened is it was within the second year within months they were turning out, they got rid of the word girls, women, we give credit, not credit, they weren't to that yet, deposits, and then they started using our, that was the other thing that came out of that. So they started using this and for advertising and using our statements, giving credit where credit's due, et cetera, and they started doing this whole campaign. By the second year, they had it all over the banks, how they loved women, and they would open accounts. But one of the fun things that came out of this, how we dreamed these things up, is we decided one time having an argument, well, they're the culprits, they're the wrong ones, why are they accusing us? And we said, let's do a 10 most wanted. They're the criminals, not us. So we did the 10 most wanted FBI poster and called it the Feminist Bureau of Investigation. Thank God I put a little asterisk up there, and down at the bottom I said Feminist Bureau of Investigation. And then there we went and got all their photos, and we put them and underneath their names, the numbers were their private phone numbers, because what happened, we had a woman work for the American bank, she says, we just took all the CEO of the corporation, especially the banks, their pictures last week for our annual blah, blah, blah. And she says, well, come by. We drove up in my little Beetle at 6 o'clock at night. Out comes a guy and hands us the package of their photos they just took that week. And so here we use their photos, their private phone numbers, and we put it for crimes against women. They are known to hang out in private clubs and athletic clubs, and they're known to discriminate against you because you're a woman. And we did it, the text of an FBI poster, and proceed with caution and blah, blah, blah. Well, we went down to Wall Street to put them out at night and paste them up. And we practiced with a 4-door car. We got the glue that the anti-Vietnam people showed us how to make this glue. You put it on posters. We practiced, and we got wigs, and we put mud on the plates and license plates, and we went down there. I'm in front of Trinity Church with the bucket, my posters, and the cops were there because people were blowing up the banks, and it was really bad times. And he yelled, stop! I run down the subway steps, and I think, uh-oh. They were rough then. I could get shot. So I come back out with my bucket, and they said, oh, you're a cleaning lady. Okay, you can go back. I can't believe this. I stood there, and I said, I'm not a cleaning lady. I'm a feminist, and we're here to... Then I went through my whole thing. I mean, out of our mind, but we did it. So they're looking at me like, well, you've got to be kidding. So I gave them a lecture on why their wife doesn't have a job. He says, okay, get out of here. You know. So we went around, but then we had to stop because the police were trailing us. They thought we were prostitutes going on us. So and then the next day we got up in the morning, we marched. Well, I found out my mother worked down on Wall Street. She said they're all over. Everybody was talking about them. And then what happened is the women in Washington, D.C. used the same thing. And one of these congressmen that worked for was part of the John Birch Society, sent my name into the Justice Department and wanted me arrested for sedition. And the Justice Department to the FBI said they didn't think it was a good idea. But the bad thing about it in some ways is I asked for my FBI files, and they said they had nothing on me. I only found out about it being the FBI file in the 80s when some newspaper in California called me up about it. And I said, well, where'd you get it? They said they asked for something else, and they showed me, and there was the Justice Department discussing with them why they should not have me arrested.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and it's so, yeah.
Well, then you went international, if that were not enough.
I know.
In Mexico City, they were having the United Nations International Women's Conference. You were there with some other subversive women. Could you tell the story about that?
Well, the Red Stockings went, and I was talking to them because we were all the groups, we worked together, and I'll explain about the chapter later about working with different groups. But I went down there, and I was working now at the bank, and I was an officer. And also the movement had changed. Doing these ZAP actions no longer, or everybody was bored out of their minds. And you made your point, and you had to know when to move on. So anyway, I went down there, and Betty Friedan had gone down there, and Jackie Ceballos, and a whole bunch of us. But there was a big controversy about this whole International Women's Year. And reading about it, basically, Escobar, his name was, I believe, the president of Mexico, wanted to become the next Secretary General of the United Nations. So he had to show the world his anti-American stance. And so that's what he did. And most of the nations at that time, one reason or another, did not feel favorable towards the United States. So on that side of Mexico, they had the United Nations session of all these countries together. And so Nelson Rockefeller paid to get where the medical center was in Mexico City, which was a huge place with huge auditoriums, for International Women's Year. So we went down there, and the hostility shown to us as American women was incredible. It's one thing in America to say one thing, but when you leave America and say it outside, it's a whole different situation. And so when we had sessions or anything, they'd be booing us. Anything that was said by any of the women, whether they're black or white or Hispanic Americans, were booed and such and such. And it got to the point, and I was just one of thousands. I mean, we were just nobodies in this whole thing. Betty was threatened. We were told, Betty Lane was the photographer, mostly for the feminist movement. And she said to me, tomorrow the embassy is having Pat Utah and Kevin, I forget his last name, for the aid to undeveloped countries, which was really an arm of the CIA. And the New York Times had called me on this and said to me, oh, are you aware that Betty Ford cannot speak at the embassy because Kissinger did not want her to go, and Ford was furious, so they're sending Pat Utah, and she told me who she was. So I get up in the morning and go across the street to the embassy, which is all open, except with those special bars they all have. And there was all of these women that I had met on the plane coming down there from different states. And I said, where are you from? Oh, I'm sent by my governor. But they weren't feminists. And they're all sitting there, and I'm in the back, freezing. And all of a sudden, out walks this Pat Utah. She looked like a Barbie doll with the hairdo, the pearls. Oh, welcome. And I flipped, and I said, you have no right to represent American women. Betty Ford should be here. You're the CIA. You're this and that. And all hell broke loose. The Marines that guard the embassies come running down. Betty Lane, 4 days before she died in the hospital, told me they had bayonets pointed at us. Honestly, I don't remember the bayonets. I do remember they had gathered guns pointed at us. So then they brought in all the representatives, and they were standing up, and one of the men said he worked for human something of an agency of our government for the sterilization of women. I mean, this is who was representing us. Well, now we go to back to the sessions. So now we had a little more smiles towards our way, a little bit, but it still was bad. So finally I said to Betty and Jackie Ceballos, why don't we get together, do a consciousness raising like we do with other women, and get a room with some of these women. And so we called it East Meets West. And there was Betty, myself, and a woman from China. So we had about 50 women came together. And some of the workers there volunteered to do the translations. And right away they started in, well, you have too much land, you have this, and all negative, negative. So I thought, why don't we do consciousness raising? And so I started talking, and then the women started changing. Because now they didn't have all the women had male partners, by the way, up to that point. In this room they did. So woman from China told us how she had to drown her baby girl because they didn't want girls. And if you had the baby, you drowned it, and as you drowned it, you said in Chinese like a prayer, and a little piece of wood you made into some symbol as you drowned it. The baby. Well, the whole room came down. And all of a sudden, the women started looking at each other and saying, we're women. We're not political. It's not political. It's not males. We are women. And then all of a sudden, the whole room opened up, and the women started back and forth talking. I found out later this picture of us was put in a magazine, and it was in China, printed in China, in national magazines in China, of us sitting up there with the Chinese woman, myself, and Betty Friedan, and Jackie Ceballos. But that was the impression we made, and out of it came the front page of, the front page of the New York Times Sunday section put about me shutting down the embassy. My mother had a stroke. She didn't think I was going to come home. I thought I was going to get fired. Nothing happened. No one wrote about it. I looked it up in the New York Times Index. That year, it was not listed. It was not listed at all. Now I think it is, but it wasn't. So, but these are the things that just spontaneously happened because you were surrounded by women of all kinds of women, all kinds of problems, all kinds of ages, economic, social, whatever. But underneath it, as someone said, you scratch underneath. I think Betty Friedan said that, and you find a woman. And that's what happened.
In 1974, you became a two-term president of Now New York.
Right.
What were the issues of greatest concern at that time?
The greatest concern at that time was, I believe, reading the newspapers from when we first hit the newspaper because of the march to 1972. Everything was happening drastically all over, changes, radical changes. Then in 72, we started sensing things were hostile or opposition, even within the women's movement. By 74, it was peaking. What I, in hindsight, feel what was happening, the powers to be called their think tanks in, nationally, government, internationally. They did not need this around the world, to put an end to it. And partially by doing is to disrupt. And we had all different levels of disruption. And working in Wall Street, in my environment where I work mostly only with males, and everything in a logical approach to things, looking at these things were not logical. There was definitely something wrong. But some good was coming out of it too, because we started having all kinds of committees and dealing with abortion, sexuality, and such like that. But having people coming in, disrupting, we either had the ultra-left, who thought we were the bourgeoisie, should be gone, anti-gays, government. We later found out the FBI did infiltrate. In fact, we had a joke because nobody wanted to take minutes and be secretary, and I said, look, if you're in the audience, do us a favor and take the darn minutes and give us a copy. You know, so, but, so that, I had to deal with that. Now, our meetings, looking back just recently, we had sometimes 6 meetings a day, 7 days a week, 30 days a month. That is how the movement was. But it was holding all these personalities together to have these committee meetings and to have it flow, that we didn't have disruptions. And finally, one of the ways I ended some of it was talking to Nancy Borman and Joanne Steele in Majority Report and some of the other groups. I said, look, why don't we just lay it all out on the table? Has the FBI, CIA infiltrated the women's movement? So I got Cara DeMia and certain people to represent certain groups, radical groups. And I made the rules, because by that time I knew all about how these people disrupted meetings. And so I stood up and I said, each speaker up there will speak 5 minutes or less, and they will answer all your questions if we have to stay here till 3 o'clock in the morning. But you have to let every speaker speak, and then I'll open up the floor, because part of the disruption tactics was to interrupt the first speaker, and you never got to the last speaker. Then I said, I learned, I will call 4 of you who will stand here. So I didn't have to go here, there, and everybody screaming, you didn't pick her, you picked me. And then I said, you have to direct your question to one of the speakers. So I tried to avoid people getting up making speeches. And then I said, then we'll go, everybody's get his chance to ask a question. And then we'll do it a second time and a third time until everybody has no more questions. We'll stay here till the morning. Well, what happened then, I turned the audience into being my watchdog for them. Because if somebody got up and started making a speech, they yelled, sit down, you only have 4 minutes, you got to ask a question. So my audience became my backup. So we went through it, and you know what happened after that? I had peace. I had a few of the usual da-da-da-da-da, but that other insanity that used to be, oh, and by the way, the elevator didn't work that day. This is all part, I mean, this is what we did all the time. So they had everybody trudged up. But this is what happened. And so that's how we calmed that down. But out of that came, by that time, everything matured to a point where we had people really doing fantastic things. There was Mitch Kovac and doing her campaign, Stand Up. Hire Me's got great legs. We had people going in, doing speeches before government, making changes at EOC, recognizing lesbianism. All of these things started really becoming coming to success stories at that time in '74.
And what would you say were your most important achievements during that time? Were there anything particular that stood out?
Because of my experience of working in Wall Street and working for a bank and knowing how they did credit reporting and such, found out that women did not have credit. You could not buy a house. You could not get a credit card in your name. Didn't matter what your salary was. It had to be in your husband's name. And I testified before the Banking Commission against Arthur Burns of the Reserve Bank and to the members of the Banking Committee of Congress on what it meant. What it meant is that 52% of your population had no investment in the system here. They had no means of wealth. If they were really wealthy, which was like 2% of the population, it still was managed by a bank. And by that, it meant the poverty level was horrific. But one case came up that really brought it to the top. I got a call from a man who says, I work for Con Edison, I dig ditches. And this is the way he talked. I dig ditches. And they think my wife, what the heck, she's a broad. You know, I went down to get a mortgage at a bank because her salary and my salary, we could get a mortgage. HUD would give them the mortgage. Those days, two people who worked in a post office, we're talking minimum income here, post office and things like, two incomes could afford a house then under a HUD mortgage. And he went to the bank in Flushing, Queens. He was told she still could become pregnant. He said, what are you talking about? Well, he said, well, I have a vasectomy. It doesn't matter. She's insinuating she could be pregnant by another man. Well, he went ballistic. And everybody he went to, his union at Con Edison, nobody would help him. He says, I'm calling you girls. What are you? Blah, 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 blah. I called up Barbara Schacht at the Civil Liberties, New York Civil Liberties. She says, you know, he's kind of rough. I said, but don't you get it? He's one of theirs. He's perfect. He's one of theirs. They don't listen to us. He's one of theirs. Well, TV got hold of him. And by that time, he calmed himself down. They loved him on the TV programs. They were considering keeping him on one of the people. The women in the audience loved him because they all related to him. HUD went ballistic when everybody found out about the sterilization, proof of sterilization. 30 days, they eliminated that law. But it took him from Con Edison to do it. We could have been down at Congress even now talking about it.
You know, you were named the New York City Commissioner of the Treasury. Who was the mayor at that time?
Koch.
Mayor Koch. In that position, how were you able to affect women's financial rights?
Well, this goes to show you, and this was 1980, 81 or so, some things change and some things never change. The higher you go up, the worse it gets. See, they weren't willing now to give women credit. They figured out 52% of the population women. This is good business. I mean, how could a department store not want women? And so now that's okay. Now they got rid of this. They got rid of this. They opened up jobs. But when you get up really into and even today, you can go out and look at the very highest positions. Then there, still we don't have women there. But it was the subtleties within the city government. My so-called liberal city government, Koch, they were the worst. And it was hard. Even I hired in my department women. My assistant was a woman. I hired gay people. That threw them in a tizzy. And all different types. And I hired them on their merits. It wasn't I hired them because. And they made our lives miserable. It was not easy.
Looking back, what were your most memorable experiences in the women's movement, and to whom in that movement do you owe special thanks?
I first have to say I owe special thanks to all the women, because there's no way I could have done these things without them. It goes to all women. But individually, looking at certain women who were there and helping, I have to say Jackie Ceballos, Betty Friedan, Denise Fuge, and there was quite a lot of women. Now in the VFA now, I now know different, women and that now I work with, that I now look towards. But back then it was basically like Linda Stein now and Betty Love. These are the women, Muriel Fox, and these are the women now I work. They come out of the movement back then, yes. But we're on a different level now, reaching out on the big global picture now.
How do your husband and 2 children support your lifelong, I don't know how you had time for the 2 children, support your lifelong fight for women's equality?
Well, my son and daughter are quiet, and I said, oh, great. But my grandchildren, they are little warriors. They go out and they're little fighters. I mean, they stand up for what's right. 2 of them stood up because they felt that some children in the school were being picked on. Others, they do various things. And like one of them now, they took in a little child that my son, who was working, was basically abandoned. And in Florida, the system is so overwhelmed, and he had so many medical issues, he probably wouldn't even have lived it. Anyway, they have this child in their family now, and it's their brother, as far as they're concerned. But they took these values, and they go out and they stand up for what's right in classrooms. I mean, they don't fight or do anything like that, but they have now, they stand up and speak for what's right.
Well, I want to say about those that you're a particularly lucky woman. You have 5 granddaughters. And as a member of the board of the VFA, what do you say to your 5 girls about their role as future feminists?
Well, basically, to stand up for what's right. You don't have to stand up verbally if you don't at the moment and place, but not to be a passive participant in it. You can do it many different ways, of going to someone above you, or writing about it, or joining a group to do something about it. And they basically, that's what they do. I'm trying to think one of them, what she did here. In one of her schools went up to the school and told them, I think even to the principal's office, that what was happening to some of the children wasn't right. And they do it in their, they don't do it as a cause. They just do it, this is the right thing. And that's what I feel is good. It's not like they're told to do it. They just feel this is the right thing to do. And each one of them has so far, has been out there and standing up for what's right.
Well, that's your legacy, and it must give you great satisfaction.